This afternoon I kind of want to go on the defensive a little bit. And it's about a record that has always, I feel, received harsh criticism. It's one in my collection, obviously, and I think it's always been slagged off. Some people liked it, but it's always had a hard time over the years, over the decades now, because it's not a young record anymore, it's old, and it's this one. Invisible Touch by Genesis from 1986. And while we're talking about covers, looking at covers, I just want to show you this. I'm sure you've seen it, but if you haven't, it's one of my favourite, if not my very favourite, portraits of the band. I just absolutely love that shot. I think it's great. Cracking picture. Now, as I said, this has received all kinds of criticism. I didn't get this for quite a while after it came out because of that criticism. I saw the band on this tour. In fact, a lot of the records I'm going to be talking about now are records that are linked to tours that I actually went to see the band on. And I saw Genesis at Roundhay Park in Leeds, 1987. And it still didn't convince me to get the record. So I didn't get the record until maybe a year later or whatever. But I think, without wishing to sound like American Psycho, I think this record is very undervalued and very underappreciated. The main criticism was it's a Phil Collins solo album. No, it's not a Phil Collins solo album, it's a Genesis album. There's only one song on here. Okay, one song on here that to me is purely Phil Collins, and that's the kind of throwaway song called Anything She Does. But even that is very, very catchy, and I really like it. But it is very Phil Collins, it's not got much to do with the band. That's the only one. The rest of it, this is a Genesis album. It just is. It's a perfectly reasonable continuation from where they were, with self-titled, Abacab and Duke. It makes sense. Those four records make sense. This is where they were up to in 1986. This is what they were doing. So it's a record very much of its time. And yes, the production is very clean, the vocals are very high, so it does, he is heard, Phil is heard. Phil is not in the background at all on this. He is heard very, very prominently, as are the drums. But that's because a lot of it was recorded using drum machines. And so obviously drum machines will dominate any record. But to me, this is still a Genesis LP. It's not a Phil Collins solo album. Okay, so it's the 13th, unlucky for some, LP by the band. And it spawned a #1 single in America, the title track. It sold 6 million copies in America. The album, not the title, not the single. 6 million, that's incredible. It got to #1 here. And it's a very good record. So what do we have on here? We have, obviously, the title track kicks it all off. Tonight, 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 Land of Confusion, and In Too Deep. These are all great Genesis songs over time. This is much better than Self-Titled. Self-Titled was a bit gloomy, to my ear. And even the band agreed that the shorter songs on Self-Titled were nowhere near as good as the shorter songs on this, and I agree fully. Absolutely. And so side 2 is start us off with Anything She Does, which is the kind of throwaway song on here. Then we have Domino, which is the big, long, bombastic Genesis classic in 2 sections. Then we have Throwing It All Away, which is not throwaway at all. And then it finishes with I think it's the last instrumental they did with Phil Collins. I think they did one on the final record in 97, but I'm not even going to talk about that, because that, to me, you can't have Genesis without Phil Collins, I'm sorry. So yeah, the Brazilian, which is, as I say, this cracking little instrumental piece. So what did the critics think of it when it came out? Now, I've already kind of said that. There was a mixed response. Kerrang, of all people, liked it. Most people didn't like it. They, as I say, they insisted that it was a Phil Collins solo album, which it is not. And my memory of this, of actually getting this, I do remember getting it. It was the late 80s, and I was kind of a little bit cautious about it, but when I got it, I'm glad I did. It's a good, solid record. I think it's better than the one that came after it, We Can't Dance, which I think is a bit of a silly record, to be honest with you, because it seems to me in places that the band were trying to get back to the 70s sound, and it simply didn't work. You can't go back. In music, you cannot go back. That's one thing I know about music. You can't go back. Now, how did it do on the charts? Well, in this country, it got to #1. In America, as I said, it got to #3, but sold 6 million. It also got to #1 in Canada, New Zealand, #2 in Germany, Holland and Finland. So Europe really embraced it, as of course did the Americans. So if you've not heard this, then give it a listen. It's not as throwaway or it's not as bad as people said it was. The other thing I like about this is, to me, it's an honest album, because they just went into the studio, they had no idea what they were going to do, blank piece of paper, and they just came up with stuff, which is what they used to do back in the 70s. So they kind of went back in that respect, but they didn't try and recreate the 70s sound, which is why I think it's an honest record. They embraced all the technology of the day, 1986, 85, 86. They embraced all that technology and made what I think is a good, solid, honest, if not dominated by electronic drums and Phil Collins, okay? A good, solid, honest Genesis record. And you should give it a listen, give it a try, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised that this is not just a Phil Collins solo album. Not at all. The tour was absolutely fantastic. They did 4 nights at Wembley to finish, sold out. Also in America, they released 5 singles of this. In America, they all charted, every single one, charted highly. This country, not so much. They still charted, but not quite as high. 5 singles, and they all charted, so that's very impressive. So, that is Genesis, Invisible Touch, from 1986.